With the new Snapdragon X chips, an OLED display, impressive battery life, AI capabilities, and a full computer OS, is the Surface Pro the game changer we've been waiting for? Well, that depends on the user. The Surface Pro is a very diverse 2-in-1 device. It has the same familiar design as previous Surface Pros with the back hinge, 2 USB ports, and a port for the Surface charger. There's also a front-facing Quad HD camera and a 1080p ultra-wide on the back for scanning documents and whatnot. Of course, you can either get this in the 10-core Snapdragon X Plus or the 12-core X Elite. This display is an OLED with an adaptive 120Hz refresh rate. It's a very bright display, and I often find myself using it with the brightness well under 50%. The contrast is great, and overall it's a solid display. I don't have any complaints here, but there's also an LCD version that comes with the Snapdragon X Plus. But I will say that while I haven't seen that one for myself, if it's anything like the display on the Surface laptop and you're looking to save some money, I don't think you'll be disappointed with the standard LCD model. Of course, you're also getting a better processor and a base 512GB SSD. But again, if it's anything like the Surface laptop, the LCD is also a great display. I've mostly been using this for productivity and entertainment, and I think that's what it's best suited for. Things like writing emails, browsing the web, taking video meetings, and even certain creativity apps. But mostly for creatives that can take advantage of the Surface Pen. It's a versatile tablet that has laptop capabilities. I will say though that it's heavier than I'd like it to be using it as a tablet. It's not a deal breaker for me, but it's heavy for one-handed use and holding it with one hand and tapping or writing with the other. It's still doable and it works, but it's kind of heavy. Like, I found that the best way to use it on one hand is to rest it on your palm instead of grabbing it by the sides and then using your spare hand to tap on it or write with the pen. Ideally though, if you're using it without the keyboard for extended periods of time, you'd probably want to use it with 2 hands or just pop it on the table and, pop the hinge. It's not like it's heavy to the point where it's unbearable, but it's more like it can be awkward and uncomfortable to hold because of the weight distribution. The touch experience on Windows isn't phenomenal, but it's acceptable and it works. I mean, it's definitely good enough in my opinion, but it's not as good as iPad OS, for example. I was thinking of ways that this could be improved so it's easier to navigate through the OS, like making buttons bigger or maybe including certain gestures and stuff. And I'm sure they have plenty of talented designers that can improve on this without losing out on functions. But honestly, part of the appeal for this new tablet with Windows on ARM is that you can run a full operating system with full functionality on a tablet, making things like transferring workflows from a traditional laptop almost effortless. So if you strip away functions that are standard on a laptop, kind of like how Apple strips away features and functions on iPad that they have available on their Mac OS, then you get this super powerful and efficient device that can't even take advantage of the hardware. By the way, I know that there's a bunch of good tablets out there like the Galaxy Tab and the ZenBook, but I'm simply comparing it to the iPad because I've used them enough to know what they're like. Anyways, my point is that while navigating Windows on a touchscreen isn't as easy as iPad OS, it's a compromise that's worth the extra capabilities, at least as long as Microsoft can continue to refine Windows on ARM and motivate developers to bring their apps over. For content consumption and things like that, it's perfectly fine, but if you're talking about doing actual work and diving deep into software, then why wouldn't you just use a keyboard or the pen anyway, So last thing on hardware I want to touch on is the speakers. They get loud enough where if you're in a loud environment, it wouldn't be an issue. They're good for watching videos, video calls, and stuff of that nature. The sound quality is good too, but obviously if you want a fuller experience, use headphones or Bluetooth speakers. You're not going to get a cinematic experience from laptop speakers, but they're good enough. So it is a 2-in-1 device, but I personally got the most use out of it in its laptop mode with the keyboard attached. There's 3 new variants of the keyboard now, a standard keyboard, one with pen storage, and their new $350 Surface Flex keyboard. I've been testing out the new Surface Flex keyboard and it is a good keyboard. I wouldn't say the typing experience is out of this world, but it definitely isn't bad. It's a good keyboard and the keys have good travel distance and the material is a soft Alcantara, so it makes resting your hands on them super comfortable. It has a built-in Copilot key, a mute mute and unmute button for your microphone, and a shortcut key for the snipping tool, which really is convenient for taking screenshots. Hands down though, the best thing about it is the trackpad. Microsoft switched over to haptic feedback instead of an actual click. So similar to Apple devices, if you've ever used one of those, it clicks back at you once pressed. It has really good feedback and the motor is really strong. This is actually better than Apple's in my opinion. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also use it wirelessly. In my use cases though, I almost never needed it. I did test it out though using Adobe Fresco while using the pen, and it's nice for keeping the device closer to you, but still having access to keyboard shortcuts like copy and paste or undoing errors, you know? One of the good and bad things that the keyboard and pen combo have is that the magnets that hold the pen in place are very strong. Maybe even a little too strong, because it's awkward getting the pen out of the slot sometimes since it doesn't have an indentation anywhere to slide your finger in. So since the magnets are so strong, you're like fighting the magnets to get the pen out of the slot sometimes. And again, it's not a deal breaker, but maybe that's something that, you know, could have been considered considering the price on the keyboard. The pen itself is fine too. This one has a more rectangular and flat design when compared to the Apple Pencil, and it has two buttons, a side button that can change what the tip can do, and a shortcut button that works as the eraser, but can also be customized to open apps. In the settings, you can also customize the pen's functions like haptic intensity. So the keyboard does charge the pen, but if you end up not getting the keyboard, you'll need to get a separate charger for the pen because it doesn't come with one. The pen will magnetize to the bottom of the tablet for storage if you don't have a keyboard, but you can't charge it to, you know, use it. The initial setup, you need to charge it for 1 second also. So just make sure if you're not getting the keyboard, which I don't know anybody that would get this, not get the keyboard, but if you're one of those people, get the charger as well. All right, so the front facing camera is really good, better than I expected it to be. And it's a quad HD camera that can upscale to 4K using AI. The backup camera is not good, but it's good enough for scanning documents and stuff like that. I don't think anyone is going to be taking pictures using this anyways. With the cameras, you also get Microsoft Studio effects like automatic framing, portrait light, background blur, and even some creative filters. The front camera is very wide, so it can take advantage of the reframing feature. This is not a machine for people looking for top of the line performance. The OS runs very smoothly and has great battery life so far, in my experience, but if your work demands a lot of computing power, this is not the computer for you. It's not that this can't do demanding tasks, but it just doesn't handle it well. Premiere Pro, which is my editing suite of choice, doesn't even work on here yet, and I did try to use Resolve, and it's not great. I will mention though that it's still in beta, but it just isn't as snappy as my x86 machine, and that's understandable because, you know, they're finally making the push to ARM now. You can make it work like I said, but if you're looking to make that like your primary use out of this machine, then this isn't for you. So I edit on a desktop that has a 13th gen Intel i9 with the RTX 4090, which isn't a fair comparison by any means, but I'm not comparing it to like the computing power. I just mean how it handles the applications and how, you know, if it has any bugs or, you know, how smooth it runs. However, apps like Photoshop, Fresco, and Lightroom were much more stable. Obviously, it isn't as powerful as my work machine, but at least the stability was there. Ironically enough though, considering this has a built-in NPU and it's heavily focused on AI, which we'll talk more about, I found myself waiting the most when I was doing things like selecting a subject or asking Lightroom to select the subject, you know, so I can create a mask. And it's not unbearable by any means, but out of all the things I used it for, that's what took the longest to do. Also, exporting photos took a little bit longer than I'm used to. Maybe that's just because I'm spoiled from my work machine, but it's not like you can't do these things, just have to have a little bit of patience. I don't really care for benchmarks too much. I'd rather look into things like real world use and performance. But I did run a Geekbench test on it with the performance mode on, and here are the results. So using Photoshop and Lightroom was a much better experience than video editing. There were hardly any times where I was waiting for the machine to catch up. Stuff like generative AI and masks took a little bit longer, but even on my x86 machine, it takes some time. If you do occasional photo editing, like touching photos up, then this will do just fine. The experience video editing is not as nice, but in a pinch you could do it. There are little things that I think can be refined in the software for a better user experience though. Like I wish it would detect the orientation and switch the volume controls. When I used it as a tablet in the landscape orientation, the left button on the volume rocker actually raises the music even though it's on the left side. Obviously, if you're using it in portrait mode, this makes sense because it's at the top, but in landscape mode, left increases the volume and right lowers it. It's also the same in its laptop form with the keyboard attached, but in that case, you can just use the key to adjust the volume. It would just be nice if they added a software update to detect the orientation and adjust what the volumes do. So Microsoft claims a 10-hour battery life when browsing the web and up to 14 hours of video playback. Of course, when they tested this, it was probably in ideal conditions, but let's talk about my experience in real world use. I mainly used it in the best performance mode. I had forgotten that I switched it to this when I was trying to run a Geekbench test on it. Literally, as I was writing the script for this video, I realized that I had lost 30% of my battery just browsing the web, looking up videos and stuff of that nature. And I usually keep 2 Chrome windows open with different profiles logged in. And each window has anywhere from 3 to 5 tabs, just to give you an idea of how much I was doing on it. For the first hour, I had DaVinci Resolve open in the background along with Photoshop and Fresco. I wasn't actively using them, but they were running in the background. Once I realized that I had drained like 30% of the battery in like the first hour because of this, I still kept it in performance mode, but I closed Fresco, Photoshop, and Resolve. So from that point on, the battery had dropped from 70% to 50% in about 2.5 hours from browsing the web, watching videos, and having Spotify open, playing some music in the background. I also had Discord open the entire time, but the last few days I have kept it in the recommended setting, which allows Windows to determine if it needs to toggle on performance mode or not. In this setting, I was getting well over 7 hours before charging. I bet you could hit that 10-hour mark depending on how you use it, but realistically, 7.5 to 8.5 hours is more realistic for my use, at least. Just about all day for me. I mean, I usually plug it in anyways because I don't like taking the risk, but like if you don't have access to an outlet, I would say definitely a solid 7 hours at least, and I think you can get it. Depending on what you do, you can get it to 10 hours. All right, to put it simply, this is not a gaming machine. If you look in the Xbox app, most games are just from the cloud, and even if you look in the Microsoft Store, most of the time it'll just tell you the PC doesn't meet the requirements to run the game. You can try to download games from other stores and launchers like Steam or Riot Games, but most of the time the games just won't work after the download. These laptops aren't really targeting gamers anyways, but just so you know, it's not ideal in its current state for gaming. All right, so these Copilot computers are supposed to be all about AI, and it does offer AI features, but honestly, I wouldn't say it's a full gimmick because some of these features are actually useful, but I think in its current state, you shouldn't get one of these for the AI features. I think they'll get much better and Microsoft will figure out what to actually focus on in terms of AI as time passes. For example, as bad as the privacy concerns were with the recall feature, that seemed to be the most useful AI feature that they were gonna add, at least in my opinion. And I'm glad it got pushed back, obviously, until they can figure out, all the security problems. But yeah, stuff like that does make for a better personal assistant. It just needs to be done right. And I think that what Apple is doing with their AI stuff and the way they're handling it with privacy first is well done. And I hope that Microsoft can copy from Apple, at least in that regard. But still, some of the AI features that are available now can still be helpful. Starting with the Copilot app, which has a dedicated key on the keyboard. It's currently just a web-based app with no local context yet. That's supposed to be updated in the future with the ChatGPT update where users can share the screen with Copilot for local context. As of now, it's just a chatbot that's integrated into the system, but it's nice to pull up whenever you have questions or need help with documents or writing or something. Live captions is also very nice. As I mentioned in my first impressions, if you saw that, it isn't perfect, but it works well enough where you can follow what's going on in the video. And the times that it does mess up and it doesn't get the words right, you can kind of just use previous context to fill in the errors. These are the two most useful AI features in my opinion, but there's also stuff like Co-Creator, which works kind of like Adobe Firefly if you've ever used that, where it can generate images from a text prompt or image you upload as a reference. You can also start sketching something in Paint and it'll generate this into an image. I think this is best for brainstorming or coming up with concepts for a bigger project. And then there's also the Windows Studio camera effects, like I talked about in the camera section. But I hope to see more AI stuff like this in the future and more useful AI features. All right, so here's my final verdict. For those people whose work doesn't demand a bunch of computing power, but does demand a versatile productivity device, this is the device for you. You don't have access to all of the apps on an x86 machine, but a lot of the major ones that you might use on a day-to-day basis like Chrome and Photoshop are there. In its current state, it's kind of like a balancing act between the good and the bad, but it at least seems like they'll be actually making a push for ARM machines going forward. The Surface Pro does a lot of things well. Not perfect, but good enough for general purpose users. It's not the lightest device ever, and it's not the most powerful device ever, but it shines with its battery life and its versatility thanks to its 2-in-1 form factor. So, as the saying goes, it's a jack of all trades, but a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one.